الصلاة والسلام عليك يا
he's not just some random person who's picked out or the only person that's willing to do this. We're actually very fortunate that he's doing this for us today, and we hope that the number will be better than this. He's represented 4 different trials related to terror trials. One was the Jack Thomas case, and one was regarding the Tamil Tigers, and another was the Penn trial and the Leeds trial. So he's very well versed, you would say?
Yes, thank you.
In the Constitution and laws regarding terror laws, ASIA laws, and all those other laws. So today he's here to explain to us what are our rights, and what are the government's rights, and what's everybody's rights, so that we don't transgress the boundaries and trespass against the boundaries on either side. Okay? Because we're a law-abiding citizens, we live according to Islam, and we're living in this country, so we need to know what are our rights so that we're not oppressed and we don't oppress. So please lend your ears to Robert Starry, and inshallah we'll benefit from his talk.
You can go ahead. Thank you very much, and first let me say it's a great pleasure to be here, and thank you for your kind invitation. I should say something about my own background so you know who I am. Firstly, my father is a post-war immigrant to this country. He was 5 years in a displaced persons camp after the Second World War and came here effectively as a political refugee, non-English speaking person. Was placed in a camp north of Albury called Bonagilla, where he was kept for 2 years and then had to work for a government organisation. At that point it was what was called the Postmaster General, or the equivalent of Telecom and Australia Post, for a period of 2 years before he was allowed to integrate into the community in 1951. He married my mother in 1954. She was a person from an English-Scottish background, and her parents basically disowned her because she had married someone who was a European Catholic. And in 1954, sectarianism unfortunately was rife in Australia, and I never really knew my grandfather because, as I said, my father was a person who came from a Catholic tradition. I then went to a Catholic secondary school in Yarraville in Footscray. I grew up in Footscray and the western suburbs. I actually grew up in a Ministry of Housing estate, and so I knew lots of my friends. Most of my friends came from non-English speaking migrant backgrounds. They were new settlers to Australia in the 1960s and 70s. But the one thing that the Christian brothers, who were our teachers, taught us was about the injustices that had been committed against Ireland, and talked about frequently the expulsion of foreign occupation, being the British troops from Ireland. Had they talked about that in 2005, they'd be arrested as anti-terrorists under the current anti-terrorism law. They would be regarded as people who are involved in an attempted destabilisation of a foreign sovereign government. That's the British in their control of Ireland. And it just goes to show you how things can change. If I took a view, for instance, to say that foreign troops should be expelled from Iraq because of their involvement in the false pretext for a war in Iraq, and foreign troops should be expelled from Afghanistan, nobody would say anything against me. I'm a white European Catholic. And even though I hold those views possibly as strongly as some of you may, there's no possibility that there'd be any action taken against me. But if you're a person from the Middle East, if you're Lebanese, or if you're Egyptian or Algerian or Syrian or wherever you might be from, and you actively, publicly supported the expulsion of Australian and foreign troops from Afghanistan and Iraq, you may well be the subject, firstly, of an investigation, you may be the subject of an interrogation, and you may be charged. And what I'll do, I'll talk about some of those cases, that we've been involved in, one of which Baha talked about, which is very current. That's the Operation Neat case, which, as you all know, is the case involving a number of Lebanese brothers and Somali brothers who have been charged for talking about how easy it might be to breach security at Holsworthy Army Barracks. So what one has to do is one has to look at counter-terrorism, and one has to look at it in the context of modern politics. And if you don't mind, I'll take a seat. Thank you. Thank you, Baha. So one has to look at it in terms of modern politics. And one thing that I've always said, having been involved in issues involving people who express an alternative political or religious or cultural view, is that you must look at the current circumstances. And without wishing to offend anybody, it's clear that unless the conflict between Israel and Palestine is resolved, then conflict with the Islamic world will continue, because it's a central issue that justice for Palestinians must be achieved. And you don't need me to tell you, when there's a public debate about that issue in Australia or the West generally, it's a very dangerous thing to embark on any criticism of Israel and their actions in the Middle East in the repression and oppression of Palestinian people, and how they should be brought to account. As soon as you say that, as you know, you are branded as being an anti-Semite, and you're criticised relentlessly by the Israeli lobby. It's easier for me to do that because I'm a European Catholic, and if I say it, I'm not criticised. But if you're a person who professes the Muslim faith, or if you're from the Middle East and you say it, then you're much more likely to be criticised and attacked. So that's the sort of context in which the 9/11, post 9/11 events have led to the establishment of what really is a wholesale attack on the community generally through the passing of these laws. We have spent, as you might know, $26 billion on counter-terrorism in Australia. We have passed 46 pieces of legislation under the Commonwealth Government eroding individual rights in favour of the state. And some of those rights that we've lost, not just in counter-terrorism, have been translated in other areas. For instance, the laws relating to ASIO, where you are obliged, where you have no right against self-incrimination, you have no right to silence, and where a hearing might be conducted in secrecy, those laws have been transferred into other areas of the law, including, for instance, the Australian Building and Construction Commission, where construction workers are effectively subject to counter-terrorism laws. And you might say, well, how is all of this possible? How have we allowed ourselves to get to this point? Once we arm in the intelligence community with the sort of powers that they have, they're not going to relinquish them. They're not going to give them back. I might use this example of my brother, who was in the management of a big shopping complex at Water Gardens in the west of Melbourne. Post 9/11, the owners of that complex, a big insurance company, became anxious about security issues. And my brother said that they received regular 3-monthly briefings from a person who was a former intelligence community officer, and kept coming to Water Gardens and saying to them immediately post 9/11, it's not a question of if a terrorist attack occurs in your shopping centre, it's a question of when. And what he saw, and he's not involved in the same way as me, and what we see is the shocking, disgraceful scaremongering that's been engaged in by those people in power. Because what it does, it reinforces power and it reinforces repression of various groups. It's no coincidence, I don't think, that when you look at the comments of David Irving, who's the Inspector General of ASIO, it's no coincidence that of the 20 organisations that have been declared as prohibited terrorist organisations, 19 of them are Islamist organisations. There are no other so-called terrorist organisations. Going back to my own history, there's not, for instance, the Irish Republican Army. There's no white supremacist group in America that's declared as a terrorist organisation, neo-Nazi organisations. There's no other organisations that might be a threat to the community that have been declared as terrorist organisations other than the 19 Islamist organisations. One other organisation that's been declared as a terrorist organisation is the Kurdistan Workers' Party, some of which may have members of the Muslim community, Sunni Muslims, but they are also declared a terrorist organisation. So this is what, I'm going to read this to you, this is what David Irving said on the 10th anniversary of 9/11. This is just 2 months ago. The head of ASIO, Australia's elite security agency, says the fact it has trebled in size since the September 11 attacks is certainly justified. ASIO Director General David Irvine said ASIO had to take on more resources to manage a unique terror threat in the wake of the attack on New York. He said that growth was certainly justified, but acknowledged there would always be debate about the size and the scope of ASIO. If you were to ask me, this is what he said, if you asked me what have been the most significant changes in ASIO in the last 10 years, I would say that dealing with the terrorist problem has required us to take on new resources for a start, use new techniques, use new technology, Mr. Irvine said in an interview with the ABC. Legislation has been adjusted to enable us to manage this at the time. Quite different phenomena, different to anything we faced in the past. Mr. Irvine related the threat to Australia from Islamic extremism at the same level it was a decade ago, but says ASIO has increasing concerns about lone wolf operators, such as the Norwegian mass murderer Anders Breivik. We do have a very small number of people in our midst whose intentions are not necessarily all that benign, he said. Mr. Irvine also warned against complacency following the death of Al-Qaeda leader Osama bin Laden. I don't think we can be complacent, and I don't think now, 10 years later, following the death of bin Laden, I don't think now is yet the time to relax our vigilance. His death does symbolise a further step in the weakening of the ability of Al-Qaeda from the Pakistan-Afghanistan area to control events, but the threat hasn't diminished because what we've seen is the Al-Qaeda ideology and objectives have been taken up by other groups. Now, I'm not an expert on intelligence and I'm not an expert on foreign affairs.